What do you think about when war is mentioned? Do you think positively? You think about the honor of defending your country, the glory gained in achieving great victories? Or do you think about the nostalgia in fighting alongside an oppressed society to put down a ruthless dictator? Or do you think of the negatives? Fear of losing your life or being subjected to the deaths of others? Anxiety over the constant gunshots, explosions, and screams? Or the despair that your actions may be contributing to harming the country even more? The negatives are what Thucydides focused on when he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Because when he wrote his book, the negatives, because despite the fact that there were both positives and negatives, the negatives outweighed the positives. But what exactly was the Peloponnesian War? Well, it happened in ancient Greece from 431 to 405 BCE. But if you want to include all the events leading up to it and the events that happened after it and as a result of it, we start from 490 all the way to 371 BCE. It starts with the Persian Wars and ends with what's called the Battle of Leuctra. Pardon me. Now, the two belligerents were the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, and the Athenian Empire, led by, of course, Athens. Their allies included, like the Peloponnesian League, their allies included groups like Corinth, Megara, and Thebes, while Athens' empire included allies like Delos, Lesbos, and the Chalcidice. You can see here on this map, the red is everything that is part of the Athenian Empire. And you've got like pretty much almost everything that borders the Aegean Sea. All these islands within it as well. The Peloponnesian League, the Peloponnesus, is this section of Greece right down here. Everything that's blue was everything that's allied to the Peloponnesian League. So you've got all the Peloponnesus in there. You've got Sparta within here, Corinth, Boeotia was allied to it for a certain amount of time, Ambracia, Macedon sort of went back and forth between Athens and Sparta. So aside from that, this war was a very important war because it was very widespread. Some like to think of it as a small-scale world war, or at the very least, a systemic war. Now, a systemic war is a war that is fought by two, but usually multiple belligerents, and whoever wins the war is pretty much in charge of that region. It's the leading superpower. So it was definitely, if not a world war, a systematic war. This involved, and it was so widespread, it involved not just Greece, but it involved the Persian Empire, it involved Macedon, it also involved Sicily over here. So it was involved almost everything that was known in the ancient Greek world. Every polis, which is a city-state in ancient Greece, in the Aegean every polis in the Aegean would eventually be forced to pick a side in this war. It got to the point where it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you want to be neutral. You're either with us or against us. And that caused many Greek city-states to be just dragged into this war that they didn't want to be a part of. There were constant shifting alliances. This war dragged on for over 27 years. Many city-states would change sides for various reasons. Macedonia would change sides repeatedly. And let's see. As an excellent example, during the Peace of Nicaeus, Mantinea, which was an ally of the Peloponnesus, had actually switched sides with the Athenians to fight against the Spartans. During 428 BCE, Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, which had agreed and just of their own volition decided to join the Athenian Empire, which at the time was called the Delian League. In 428, they decided to rebel against Athens. And most importantly, 480, the Greeks united against Persia during the Persian Wars, and they made concessions to make sure that to be on their guard and be defensive in case Persia tried to attack them again. Well, by 414 BCE, the Persians allied with Sparta against Athens. Now, all of this is recorded in a book titled The History of the Peloponnesian War, written by a general or strategos named Thucydides. And Thucydides, he served in the Peloponnesian War. He was in charge of guarding a small island up here known as Amphipolis, and he ended up losing when the Spartans invaded that region and convinced many of the populace to rebel, and he was therefore exiled. He was exiled, and I believe for 424 or 423 BCE, and he took this time to write the histories from multiple perspectives of not just the Athenians, but the Spartans and the Macedonians as well. His method, with Thucydides, he wrote about multiple sides of the war to reach the truth. When it came to stuff he actually experienced, he wrote as many details as possible about it. And when it came to stuff he didn't experience, he would ask many people that were there at the time, and he would gather his information based on that. He refers to his history book as a possession for all time. So it wasn't just how should I say this? He didn't intend his work to be just another history book to just record history, but as a lesson to be learned about the elements of war and that they are present in every war throughout history. And he would prove to be right. There are many parallels with the Peloponnesian War and various other wars throughout history. Now, he emphasizes the tragedies of war. And in his tragedies, it wasn't just about grand victories. Peloponnesian War covered things like inept, rash, hesitant, and self-centered leadership, strategies of protracted attrition, wasted resources, severe punishment to generals that lost battles, subjugation, slavery, disease, famine, stasis or civil strife, revolts, civil war, what's referred to as the horrors of revolution, land devastation, and even genocide. This is what he emphasized in his writings, and these outweighed all the positives of war, like glory. Now, there were some productive events. There was reasonable discourse on declaring war, punishing captured rebels, and motivational speeches. There were valiant victories. For example, the Battle of Delium was a very good victory that happened during the Peace of Nicias. And Agaspotami in 405 BCE is the very last battle that ended the war. There were also attempts at peace treaties. The 30 Years' Peace, which occurred after the First Peloponnesian War, and the Peace of Nicias, which occurred like halfway down the Peloponnesian War. Now, that being said, there are limitations in his writings. There's a lack of Spartan perspective, at least in comparison to Athenian perspective. But this is understandable, because Thucydides was an Athenian, and he had not been to the Peloponnesus until after his exile, so he wouldn't have first-hand accounts of events within Sparta during the first half of the Peloponnesian War. It's also incomplete, and therefore we have to rely on other sources that continue the work. It ends in 411 BCE, and we find this very strange because Thucydides lived throughout the entire war. Because he makes references to this in his book, he says he makes dates in relation to dating to the end of this war. So he was alive during the war. Now, why he stopped writing about the war remains a mystery even to this day. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture, I'm going to be presenting multiple videos on the subject. I'm going to start with the foundations of Greece, and that's going to be things like the... Start with the foundations of ancient Greece. And that's going to be things like the laws of Sparta and the Peloponnesus, their allies, Athens, their societies and governments, hoplite warfare, and the navy. How that evolved and played a major part in Greek history. Then we're going to cover the Persian Wars, which is going to include the Ionian Revolt, the Battle of Marathon, Thermopylae, Plataea. I'm also going to do some discussion about the Persian Empire itself. Then I'm going to go to the Pentaconta Aetia, what's referred to as, also known as the 30 Years. And this was the 30-year period between the end of Plataea and the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And this is also a period where Thucydides starts his book. And I'm going to be discussing things like how the Athenian Empire develops. The first Peloponnesian War, there were actually two of them, and the first Peloponnesian War leads into what we refer to as the Great Peloponnesian War. How democracy is established in Athens, and various attempted revolts by those within the Athenian Empire, and some within the Peloponnesian League. Then after that, we're going to cover the Peloponnesian War, and the Peloponnesian War has been divided into three phases. The first phase, which is known as the Archidamian War, this one emphasizes both sides using strategies of attrition that mostly protracted the war rather than try to decisively defeat the enemy. The second phase is the Peace of Nicias, which concludes the Archidamian section of the war. But even though this was a peace, it still had battles in it. For example, the Battle of Mantinea, and one of the turning points of the Peloponnesian War, which was the Sicilian expedition. At the very end, I'm going to discuss the third phase, which the war reignites, and is referred to as the Declaean War, and most of these are naval battles and revolts. And at the very end, I'm going to talk about the aftermath, which is what resulted at the end of this war, and this includes like the reign of the 30 tyrants, the Corinthian Wars, and the Theban-Spartan War. Now, as for other primary sources to the Peloponnesian War, aside from Thucydides, there was Herodotus, who was the first historian in Greek history. And he's also known as the father of history. His histories go from the year 714 to 479 BCE. And he talks about the various foundations of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and the Persian Empire. The second is Xenophon's Hellenica, which takes off right where Thucydides leaves off. He even starts off the book with the first sentence, "and after all that happened," referring to Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Now, it goes from 411 to 362 BCE, And it includes, as I said, the end of the Peloponnesian War, as well as the March of the 10,000. And this is also more detailed in another book of Xenophon's called the Anabasis. However, Xenophon isn't as detailed as Thucydides. Then there's Diodorus Siculus, or Diodorus of Sicily. He lived from around 90 to 30 BCE. He wrote the Bibliotheca Historica, which was a collection of 40 books that go from the Trojan War all the way to 30 BC to where he passes away. And the specific area that we're focusing on with the Peloponnesian War are his books from Book 11 to 1434, and that's the Persian Wars to the fall of Athens. And his book pretty much reinforces the accounts of Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. Last but not least, Plutarch's Lives are biologies of various Greek figures, Greek leaders like generals and kings, and specifically prominent figures of the Peloponnesian War. Now, last but not least, I'm going to end each section with what's called a possession for all time, and this is where I'm going to take a subject that we talked about in today's lecture and compare it to another event in history, because as I said, the Peloponnesian War has been compared to various things in history, many times compared to World War I. For today's, I'm going to be comparing the Thucydides with Wilfred Owen, because both of these used war as tragedy as a theme. So Thucydides, he wrote about the Peloponnesian War, and Wilfred Owen wrote poems on World War I. Both of them were officers. Thucydides was a general, and Owen was a second lieutenant. Thucydides, he served in Amphipolis, and Owen served in the Battle of the Somme. Now, the Battle of the Somme in World War I was a battle that lasted 5 months. And it dragged on. There was much suffering, and it resulted over 1 million combined casualties of both sides. Now, when Wilfred Owen experienced the Battle of the Somme, he experienced some pretty hard times during that battle. He had sprained his ankle and fallen into a pit at one point that was covered, and he wasn't able to get out because it was locked, and he was there for, I think, 3 days. And there's also a moment where, during an explosion, the body of his commanding officer landed on him. Now, after experiencing all of this, he soon realized war was not a glorious thing. And he wrote his poems based on that. He wrote poems. His most notable work was known as Dulce et Decorum, and I've got the poem right here. I'm going to read. Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod, all went lame, all blind. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes with writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the crud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And that's Latin for it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So, that was the first slide on my lecture of the Peloponnesian War. Now, one thing I'm going to add here is in the comments section, for those of you who want to contribute to this, if you find like other moments of history that you can compare to the sections we talk about in the Peloponnesian War, by all means, leave comments of other instances that you can compare to this section. And there have been many comparisons over history when people have written about the Peloponnesian War, whether it be Donald Kagan or Victor Davis Hanson. They've compared the Peloponnesian War to World War I, the Cold War, World War II, just various events. So I hope you all liked it. As you can probably tell, this is my first time doing a YouTube video, but like and comment and subscribe if you liked it. And I will see you next time. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy. You all take care.